Hello everyone and welcome to this flipped classroom lesson on the Revolutionary War. If you guys at this time can take out your guided notes that go along with this lesson, as we go through today we'll be filling those out. And at any time feel free to pause, rewind, restart this recording, whatever you guys feel comfortable with, so that you can get the information. So previously we talked about early battles in the Revolutionary War, such as the Battle of Lexington, Concord, Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, and we're also talking in class about the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which was when the colonists said, we're fighting not just so that we can get more rights from England, but to be our own independent country. However, even though the colonists signed this, England didn't care. England didn't consider the colonists their own country, so the Revolutionary War still had to continue until England surrendered and said, okay, now we admit that you are an independent country. And at this point in the Revolutionary War, things weren't going very well for the Americans. So in 1776, the British had been forcing the Americans to retreat. The British were close to taking the important city of Philadelphia. And American morale was very low. The soldiers weren't feeling good about their position. People were even deserting, leaving the army because they just felt hopeless that they had no chance to beat this powerful British army. There was a famous writer around this time, Thomas Paine, who really believed in American freedom, and he still believed despite all of these challenges. He wrote a famous line around this time saying that these are the times that try men's souls, meaning that these times they're very difficult. You really have to soul search to get through it, but you can do it. And also George Washington, the general of the American army, was planning a bold attack to try to turn around the Americans' fortunes and start doing better in this war. This is a famous painting of this bold attack. I want you guys to take a minute and look at the painting, see what you notice about it. See, for example, what time of year you think this painting took place and you think this battle took place based on the hints in the picture. And what happened as a result of this painting was the Battle of Trenton, it's called. You can see on this map here Washington crossing the river, as was depicted in the painting, crossing the Delaware River into Trenton, New Jersey. And another amazing thing about this is that the Americans did this on Christmas night. So not only are they trying to secretly cross this river, they're doing it on Christmas night, 2,400 soldiers over a near frozen river. You can imagine what that was like for the Americans. They had just signed the Declaration of Independence a couple months ago, and now they were crossing a frozen river to try to do a sneak attack on the British. It must have been a very emotional, very crazy experience for them. But they did do this surprise attack on Trenton early morning, December 26th. And in Trenton were German mercenaries. You guys can remember from our previous lessons what mercenaries are. People that were kind of hired by the British to help out their army, even though they weren't British themselves. And the Americans defeated these German mercenaries, and this was a big victory for the Americans because they were struggling so much. So to have this win, it really did help morale some for the Americans. However, there were still a lot of battles to come. And one of the key ones, one battle that people often say was a turning point in the Revolutionary War, is called the Battle of Saratoga. So Saratoga is in New York, and the British were trying to take this town of Saratoga in order to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. Since the colonies in New England are north of New York, and the rest of the colonies are south, the British thought if they could control this area, New England would not be able to communicate with the rest of the colonies. And since, as we talked about, so many of the early battles and so many of the major events leading up to the Revolutionary War took place in New England, being able to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies would really help out the British a lot. However, at this Battle of Saratoga, the Americans won. 6,000 American colonists defeated the British. You can imagine how big this was. Now New England is not cut off from the rest of the colonies. America has a big victory, not a surprise victory, like the Battle of Trenton, but a big victory where both sides knew they were going to fight. And as I said, and as a lot of people believe, this was a major turning point in the Revolutionary War. So things are definitely starting to get better for the Americans. And as we said as well, this battle secured New England. New England was not cut off from the rest of the colonies now. And it really made the situation much better for the American army. And again, it showed that the Americans had a real chance to win the war. However, there were still many challenges to come. One of the big ones was a very cold winter the Americans had. You can see some pictures, some recreations or artist depictions of it here. This was the winter of 1777 into 1778, when the army of George Washington camped out in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, which is right up the road from here. So the British were in Philadelphia at this time, so Washington had to find another place to camp out the army to wait out the winter. And as I said, this was a really cold, really harsh winter. Brutal winter, and there were 11,000 American soldiers here who really lacked the things they needed to get through a cold winter. And think about how cold it is outside right now with the snow and the wind and everything, but here we have heating today, we have clothing to cover us. The soldiers didn't have these things. As you can see, they had log cabins maybe to stay in, but these weren't very good at protecting them from the cold. And they had little food, little clothing, and you can just imagine how difficult that made it, having no protection against the cold and having to stay out here in this barren area, this cold area for months to wait out the winter so that they could begin to fight again. So this was a very difficult time. Some good things did come out of it. One of them was that the soldiers were being trained by somebody around this time, a German soldier named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. We learned a little bit about von Steuben from previous videos that we saw. He was a European who came over to America and helped to train the army, training them to show them how to march, how to shoot their guns, how to use bayonets, things along those lines in order to make this ragtag army, this inexperienced army, more professional and more efficient at their jobs. And because of help from von Steuben, the army became much better. So while they did have these good things come out of Valley Forge, it was still a very difficult winter. You can imagine being cold all of the time for months on end with little food, little clothing, and just waiting for spring. How difficult that must have been. You can see a map here showing where Valley Forge is and where, for example, the Battle of Trenton was. So just to give you guys kind of a visual understanding of this area where a lot of the war was going on. And it's cool to think too that this is the area we live in today. And so many key parts of the Revolutionary War happened right in our backyard. It's kind of exciting to think about. In addition, the colonists got help from other groups during the Revolutionary War. This is a key point to think about. It's not often talked about as much as it should be, but it's important to remember that this war was not just the American colonists versus the British. First, to highlight one key group of American colonists, which were African Americans. About 7,000 African Americans served for George Washington's army. However, many also fought for the British because many of the African Americans at this point were enslaved in the colonies, and the British told these slaves, if you fight for us, you will get your freedom. And so that was obviously a very exciting offer. Later on in the war, the Americans would offer some slaves freedom as well, but the British were definitely the first to do this, and certainly led to a lot of African Americans logically joining their side. As far as foreign countries, the French played an important role. We saw this a little bit in The Patriot, how the French supplied money and weapons to the Americans as well as soldiers. There's a famous quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And if we can remember from the French and Indian War, how the French and English were really enemies. So the French saw, oh, the British are fighting this new war. Let's help out the other side. And we can hopefully get back at the British a little bit. So even if the French didn't necessarily help the colonists because they really liked them, they did help them because they really did not like the British. And that's the same case for other European countries like the Spanish and the Dutch, who are people from the Netherlands. These countries were other powerful European countries who did not like England, and because of that, they helped out the colonists so that England, they hoped, would lose the war and lose some of their power, and Spain and the Netherlands and France could gain more power. And these groups were certainly also key to the Revolutionary War. And spoiler alert, but the Americans did end up winning the war. And this happened partly because after the British lost the Battle of Saratoga, the British started moving down south to try to get some of these colonists and try to attack the colonies in the south. And this started out late in 1778. During this time, the British also had help from an American soldier named Benedict Arnold, who was originally on the side of the colonists, but ended up switching sides. And he's became a traitor, really betrayed the American army so that he could join the British army. And he's still a very famous person today. Even today, you might hear somebody called a Benedict Arnold if they betrayed somebody. And during this war in the South, the Americans used a lot of guerrilla warfare to slow down the British. This is another thing we learned about before and we saw in The Patriot, that this kind of unorganized guerrilla warfare against the more orderly British army was often effective. And it's important with this to realize too that all these battles were not big battles like Saratoga or like Bunker Hill, that these guerrilla warfare battles could be little battles, little skirmishes, that a lot of these put together really played a big part in the Revolutionary War. And at the end of the war, the British were still trying to hold on in the South. And General Cornwallis, who we learned about a little, and who was one of the key members of the British Army, he moved his army into Yorktown, Virginia. He was hoping to replenish his supplies to get more stuff so that his army could eat and could continue to move around. However, when he got here, the French Navy surrounded Yorktown by sea, and Washington surrounded it by land. So Cornwallis was trapped. He had the French on one side in the ocean, and he had Washington and his army on the land. And because of that, he was really stuck and he had to surrender. So after 3 weeks of being trapped between the French and the Americans, Cornwallis surrendered and the Revolutionary War was over. We can see that on this map here. We have Yorktown and the British in here, and here are the French surrounding them in the river, in the water here. And also here you can see the soldiers, French soldiers as well as American soldiers surrounding them in the land. So there's really nowhere for General Cornwallis to go. So now the war was over, it was time to make peace with Britain. And this peace was made in what's called the Treaty of Paris. And this was negotiated by people like Ben Franklin and John Adams, famous American patriots, who were in France with British representatives, and these people negotiated the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. And because the Americans won the war, they got most of what they wanted in this treaty. First and foremost, they got independence. America was now an independent country, and England recognized that America was an independent country. And the boundaries of this new country were set from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to the Mississippi River on the west, from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. So these 13 colonies, which started out 8 years ago with the shot heard around the world in the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and fought a very long and very difficult war that lasted 8 years, and then at last won the war. So if you guys could fill out those guided notes and the questions on them, that would be great. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.